Hello and welcome. I am Paisley Rectal, Utah's Poet Laureate. I'll be speaking very slowly because I think there'll be people trickling in since we just opened the virtual doors to the Utah Poetry Festival 2022. I'm delighted to open up today's weekend core festival events with today's craft session, Poetry Slam, Poetry Out Loud versus Poetry Slam. I'd like to acknowledge that this event is taking place virtually on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes, and Utah is home to 8 distinct tribal nations. Before handing over this panel to the moderator, Willy Palomo, I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Utah Division of Arts and Museums and the Utah Humanities Council for making these events possible. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you for coming and supporting poetry. If you're interested in today's event, you may be interested in more of our virtual craft talks taking place today, or our final headline reading tonight at 7 p.m., which is also taking place virtually. You'll get to hear John Belk, Danielle Dubrasky, and Nancy Tekakt, all poets from Southern Utah, who will be reading from their just published collections. You can register for these at our website, www.utahpoetryfestival.com, a link which I'll also put in the chat. I'll also put the schedule link in the chat for all of you to see the other talks today and events that are going on statewide the rest of this month. All registration and location information can be found via that link. There's pretty much an event happening someday, every day near you. Today's speakers have books out, and we have a wonderful virtual book fair going on. I'll be putting the link to our book fair into the chat throughout the session to remind you to support our wonderful poets by purchasing their books. Today's session is a largely informal conversation between the panelists. To ask questions, please use the Q&A feature. To sing our panelists' praises, please use the chat feature. Your moderator will be handling the questions and reading them to the panelists as needed. That's the housekeeping for this evening. So now, thank you, and I turn this over to your wonderful moderator, Willy.
Thank you so much, Paisley. Welcome everybody on your Saturday morning. I know you're missing your favorite cartoons for this, and we love it that y'all are here. And thank you, Paisley, for being one of the most phenomenal state poet laureates I've ever seen. The Utah Poetry Festival lineup, the Mapping Literary Utah, it's all been wonderful to see that grow throughout Utah. We have a fun conversation for today, all about poetry out loud, poetry slam, and ways we can engage our youth and just poetry activity. And this work is really meaningful for a lot of these teens because it's one of the few spaces they get where they can sometimes be able to express themselves in this way. So we're going to be talking about some of the, joys of organizing this, some of the challenges of organizing these sort of programs. The questions that we're going to be asking our panelists today are what experiences you have with Poetry Out Loud, Poetry Slam, or in adjacent programs. What are the pros and cons of the Poetry Slam organizing? What are the pros and cons of the Poetry Out Loud organizing? And how can we bridge the divide between some of these programs? And what tools have you used to get students interested in Poetry Out Loud or Poetry Slam? With that, I'll go ahead and introduce our first panelists. They're going to each be given 5 to 7 minutes to talk about these questions. And then we're going to go ahead and jump into a group discussion with questions in the Q&A and what people are engaging with in the chat. And I do have to say, we were supposed to have 4 panelists, but one of our teachers got sick. So please send good vibes over to Amanda Hurd. She very much is in lack of her voice right now. So we're sending her good energy over at Kearns High School, where she leads a phenomenal debate and poetry slam program. Our first panelist is going to be somebody who I love and respect dearly and who I do definitely owe pupusas to. Their name is Jean Tokuda Irwin, BA, MA from U of Texas, UTPB since 91. Arts Ed Program Manager, Utah Division Arts of Museum, serves on the National Assembly of State arts agencies, AE's DEIA Committee, National Endowment for the Arts, Poetry Out Loud Access Working Group, Spy Hop Advanced Board. Past professional service includes NAA and sister SAAs, reviewer for President's Committee for Arts and Humanities Youth Arts Award from Clinton to Obama, has done a lot of amazing work throughout museums, even has some like experience with the MPTA board and added dance and film to national reflections, has been a huge award winner in Utah just because of their hard work bringing different artists and different writers to our state, and making those opportunities available for educators. And also I see this human at so many arts events. I wonder where they sleep, how they sleep. And with that, I'll give the floor over to Jean Tokuda Irwin. Thank you so much for being here, Jean.
You're welcome. I'm still kind of in the glow of the most recent Poetry Out Loud competition. For some reason, our three top candidates really captured people's attention, and they've been requested numerous times, most recently by the Department of Community and Cultural Engagement's staff retreat, and that was an appearance with the Lieutenant Governor. And it's been really interesting at the capacity of some of these kids to not just recite, but just ingest the poem. And I've been really curious about the conversation about poetry out loud versus slam poet. One of the major criticisms I hear of poetry out loud is the kids aren't writing their own work. And I think about that because I love the act. I'm in arts education, so the act of art making is really important to me in whatever discipline. But to me, when I think about that comment, it's kind of like, well, we have kids in theater on the stage acting in Shakespeare and Arthur Miller and Marcia Norman, and we don't say that's not valuable because they didn't write the script and they weren't the playwright. And so I think there's such room for both and the cross-pollination. And Sally, your daughter is probably one of the best examples of that. The fact that she's won the original writing poet competition, 2 or 3 years in a row, and a couple of awards this year. And she's also been a competitor, in Poetry Out Loud. So I really would like to see the two coming together. I think for me, one of the most valuable things about Poetry Out Loud is just the honking access to poets from all over the world, and particularly in the United States, both ones that are no longer on the planet and also the ones that are alive and still writing and still creating. And just that resource, even if you didn't do Poetry Out Loud as a classroom activity and you didn't have kids involved, just that resource that's available at a student or a faculty fingertips, I think is invaluable. And I also love the range of poetry. And when we talk about the voice, the student voice, I noticed that the kids who always capture the national competition in all levels, they're the ones that literally eat the poem and it comes out as them. And you're standing there thinking, oh, but that was written by so-and-so, but you're going, wow, that is him, and that's his poem, and that's how he's found his avenue for self-expression, even though he didn't write the text. And I have so totally enjoyed seeing that. I think the website itself offers many tools for teachers, suggestions for implement, of course, one step-by-step implementation process for how to organize competition in your school. And then there's also all the instructions for regional and for people like me, who are, there's one of me in every state and 5 territories. And so there's all those resources Now they've added some things. And what was really interesting is Willie was my intern from Westminster. Gosh, when was that, Willie? Years ago, before he went off to grad school. And one of the things I asked Willie to do that the kids were frustrated by is there were kids that were interested in like war poems or nature poems or falling in love. And at that point, the anthology wasn't searchable by topic. And so I asked Willie, for us, will you please come up with some larger categories, you know, like falling in love or climbing mountains or being a soldier, those kinds of things. And he did. And I shared that with colleagues around the country, and they love that. And with a lot of yammering on our part, they now have categories. So students can go in and select because of a certain kind of poetry that they like, and they're adding to that. There are now well over 1,000. So again, just the resources and the range of poetry. I think the single greatest challenge for me in sharing this in the state is, you know, all of us know what's on your plate as teachers. I mean, it's just, I'm always just horrified at all the extra things that teachers are asked to put on their plate, in addition to teaching the kids. And all the various challenges that have come up, whether it's been because of issues of Black Lives Matter or the virus or anything, the increased violence that we're seeing across the nation. I think you hold so many issues that you're responsible for in your classroom. And so asking a teacher to do something, to add one more thing that sometimes may not be part of their instruction. I have had teachers tell me that getting involved in Poetry Out Loud opened their interest. They were English teachers, but it was Poetry Out Loud that absolutely have turned them into poetry fans. And that really kind of surprised me, because I guess I thought English teachers kind of landed in the classroom and they had their own things that were near and dear to their heart. And I didn't realize that they would also discover something as a classroom teacher in offering something to their kids that would really engage them and make them followers of a certain poet, or a kind of poetry, a certain time period in poetry, that type of thing. So it's always a challenge of asking teachers. And I noticed that most of many of the kids that get involved are from private schools that have more flexibility than a public school teacher has. So I realized that when a public school teacher does this, it's really an extra load on their lap. And I realize that, and I do think that's a challenge. And it's not something like writing poetry or writing an essay in a classroom. It's not something that you can assign as a requirement. And I realize that. I do know of teachers that give kids extra credit for engaging in Poetry Out Loud. And what are some of the other questions I'm missing? I love to see the carryover. I loved seeing the carryover, and I've loved some of the things that's happened to the kids. One of our students got won third place at the national level with a Ferlinghetti poem, and she used her money to go to Reed College. And while she was a junior, she called me and I said, Madison, slow down. You're breathless. Are you okay? And she says, am I okay? I just got a letter from Ferlinghetti. And I said, the poet that's old? And she said, yes. And apparently the National Endowment for the Arts had sent him a video of her recitation. And he wrote her this lovely letter about how happy he was that she presented his poem in that manner, and that made him, that was one of the joys of his his poetic career, that a student would take that poem and present it so well, and with all the nuances that he would have liked. And of course, he's no longer alive, but that letter really meant a lot to her. Our first winner, Claudia Borjas, who won on Arena Espiat poem, Bilingual Bilingue, and some of the words are in Spanish and English. She so captured the attention of the poet Rena Espiat, and Claudia wasn't able to go to national for other kinds of reasons, that Rena sent her a whole box of poems with things tagged, and including all of her own work. And Claudia's in her 30s now, and that is one of her most valued possessions, is the letters and the exchanges she's had. And the exchanges between kids and live poets, that's really common. You hear kids at the national level talk about, I had a conversation with, and one had a conversation with Joy Harjo, who is now the National Poet Laureate, before she was a poet laureate. And so I think those kinds of opportunities have opened some avenues for our kids in ways that they've been able to capitalize on that in a variety of ways as they've gone on to higher ed. One of our winners a couple of years ago, Olivia Slaughter, recited the poem about being half Black and half white, and I can't remember the title of it now. She's now in school at Columbia University, majoring in literature with an emphasis in poetry and biology. And she told us that it was the poetry that kept her life sane as she was exploring the sciences, and it's a kind of a retreat place for her to escape into. And so, I think there's just a lot of unintended or not planned presence that come out of engaging in not just poetry out loud, but slam poetry as well.
Thank you so much, Jean, for those experiences. Those are some amazing stories. We're going to move on quickly to our next panelist. Mix Matthew Vanderlin has been teaching English at Judge Memorial Catholic High School for 7 years since they first moved to Salt Lake City from Oregon as a part of the graduate program in education. While they specialize in teaching academic research and formal presentation, they have always had a love for poetry that goes back to their own childhood and youth. It was their high school speech and debate teacher, Ms. Debbie Heron, that introduced them to poetry slams and spoken word poetry. During their undergraduate years at the University of Portland, they helped organize a multi-club campus-wide poetry slam featuring the poet Shihan, who's this legendary LA poet. You can find him on places like Def Jam Poetry, still really involved in the scene down there, and yes, an incredible human. At Judge Memorial, they have had their students participate in poetry out loud whenever possible and help to coach the students from Judge who advance to the regional and state levels of the competition. Everybody, please give it up for Mix Matthew Vanderlin.
Thank you so much, Willie. I really appreciate that. Wonderful. Hearing those stories, Jean, is absolutely delightful from the perspective of the organizer who kind of has that long history with it. That's so cool. So thank you for that. Yeah, I've been working with Poetry Out Loud since I started teaching at Judge. Judge has a unique relationship with Poetry Out Loud where every one of our students participates every year. So we make it a part of our curriculum, and every student performs in their classes, and then we take kind of the top of each class. They perform for kind of all the English classes in a given class period. And then from there, we have kind of 15 finalists that our faculty then judge and send someone to our regional competition. Overall, it's an amazing program at Judge, and we have such amazing performers from across all different kinds of perspectives and ages and interests. We have classic poems, we have contemporary poems, and it's just a beautiful experience. And it's something that I, in finding at Judge Memorial, I definitely knew that this was something that I wanted to continue fueling and continue helping as well at Judge. With regard to Poetry Slam, I have a lot more experience with Poetry Slam earlier in my life. So as you know, Willy mentioned in my introduction, I got into spoken word poetry when I was a senior in high school. And it's funny that, you know, Jean, you mentioned the importance of, you know, these students performing the poems, talking to the poets. I got that opportunity. I performed slam poetry by a poet named Mike McGee, and started to win several, you know, small competitions around Texas, where I grew up. And one day I decided, you know, what if I just reached out to him and told him what I'm doing? And so I sent pictures of the trophies that I won, and I said, you know, thank you so much for amazing poetry. It means so much to me. And he responded, and he's like, oh my gosh, it's like I have a little sibling down in Texas. This is so cool. And so he and I had this really cool moment of communication and connection. And years later, that came full circle. I was attending a poetry slam in Portland, Oregon, and he was on stage. And I walked up and I was like, I don't know if you'll remember me. And he goes, oh my God, you're the dude from Texas. And it was just this absolutely like, oh my, like, so the binding power of that poetry, right? Even if we're performing poems that aren't ours, there's still something so meaningful in the connection that comes from that. And I think, you know, I lived that, and I want my students to live that too, which is one reason I'm so strongly supportive of Poetry Out Loud. One of the definite cons for us at Judge Memorial, though, is in making it a part of our curriculum, there are a lot of students that don't want to buy in. And I think there's sometimes a difficulty in getting students to care about these older poems, these classic poems, these, you know, a poetic style that they might not be super into, but is still kind of like one of the options that we want to put forward to them. So I've actually found immense success in working with students to find kind of themes, as you were talking about. And so I teach kind of a theme-based curriculum, and we talk about things like, you know, death and grieving across different cultural ideas. We talk about speculative fiction, how, you know, fantastic storytelling can allow us to better interpret kind of what's going on in the real world. And when I open it up like that, and I kind of give students that funnel, if you will, they tend to find poems that really speak to them. And that has been something that's really cool to see. And then there's definitely, you know, some students buy into it a lot more than other students. I think that's just a truth of the situation, right? Some students will do the bare minimum, and we get a lot of students that perform the first poem they find. And so we hear the same poem over and over again some years. And then other students will dive deep and find poems that speak to their experiences, that speak to their unique, you know, identity. Our school winner this year, actually, Araxen Olivares, had a beautiful poem about his heritage and, you know, Spanish and kind of walking that dual line, you know, attending a majority, you know, white school, but also being, you know, a young Latino man. And he owned that poem, and it was absolutely beautiful to see him advance to the state level. And we were so proud of him for that. But one of the things that I have definitely thought about in the bridging of Poetry Slam and Poetry Out Loud. I only found out about this program recently, but it's called the Classic Slam by the organization Get Lit in Los Angeles, California. And it's not, they call it a national poetry slam, but I don't know how widespread it is. But I was really impressed by the structure, because it's like Poetry Out Loud, where students find a poem from, you know, a large curated collection, and they have to memorize it, they have to perform it, and then they write a response. And that small addition to me allowed this very cool interaction of students effectively entering the conversation with these classic poets, with these poets who have, you know, passed away in the 1800s, but they're still able to kind of take their words and talk about them and react and interact and look at how those words affect us today. And I've kind of been working my way through the collection of that, the old classic slams. They've been going for about 11 years now. And it's something that I would love to incorporate a little bit more in my classroom specifically, and hopefully at Judge. And I don't know if it's something that could even be implemented at a larger scale, but yeah, the opportunity there for not only encountering and finding poetry that speaks to them and then channeling kind of their passion for that, but then for those that are interested, writing those responses, right, and entering into conversation with those poets, I think would be such an amazing opportunity. The work that I've seen Get Lit do and kind of diving into just what they have publicly available has been really impressive, right? These poems and these poets in a lot of ways, you know, they take something that speaks to them and then they get to add on to it, or they get to counter it in some ways. And it creates this beautiful artistic conversation that I am kind of humbled by every time I watch one of these videos, to see these young people really take, you know, the words of a classic poet and then say, well, what does this mean to me? How can I speak to this? What does this mean in our world today? Now I'm actually going to tell you what I think about it. And so that's something that I would love to incorporate a bit more in my classroom, but albeit, you know, limitations. As you said, teachers, we got our plates full with a lot. So it's been a slow process in getting that out there. But it's one option that I found that I think would be an amazing way to bridge the divide between these two styles of poetry and poetry performance.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Matthew, for sharing your experiences. We're going to go to our last panelist now, Sally Wilde. Sally Wilde started teaching high school English and creative writing in 2001. She took a hiatus in 2006 to focus on raising her 5 amazing children and has been back to teaching since 2015. She has taught many of the language arts elective and even started a performance poetry class at Harriman High School. She has been the Cannon's Granite Jordan Regional Poetry Out Loud coordinator for almost 5 years. She is a member of the Utah High School Poetry Slam Initiative and tries to share her love of poetry with everyone she comes into contact with. The last few years, as she's watched her daughter excel in high school poetry arena, she's wondered if it was fated for her to become an English/creative writing teacher, just so she could help coach and support her daughter in her poetic ambitions. And yeah, her daughter is an amazing poet, great at both slam poetry and poetry out loud. Sally Wilde is currently an assistant principal at Bingham High School, and she continues to share her love of poetry with those around her. In her free time, if she gets free time, she enjoys doing anything with her family, reading, traveling, and eating delicious food, as we all do. Please give it up for Sally.
Thanks, Willie. Kind of overwhelmed sitting here and listening to Matthew and Jean's stories and the things they've done. I became involved in poetry as a high school student, and I was on the Lit Mag, and my advisor, Karen Durant, was, we had every month we had to recite a poem, and it was before Poetry Out Loud was around, but it really got me started in realizing the importance of finding someone else's words and like Jean said, making them your own, right? Eating them up and swallowing them and then regurgitating them as your own. And so when I started teaching early on, when I was just a young teacher, I incorporated that. And then also, though, I love the idea of making your own poem, and the whole slam idea was just coming into Utah at that time in 2001, 2002, and probably was way before then too, but that's when I started hearing about it more. And I went to Barnes & Noble and bought a Poetry Slam for Dummies book, and once a quarter, that was our big end of the quarter assessment in creative writing, is you got to choose a piece and present it as a poetry slam. And it was a good excuse to bring food in and have fun, and kind of a more casual but very competitive day as well. So when I came back to teaching in 2015, we were sitting as English teachers, and the former person who'd been over Poetry Out Loud just said, I can't do it anymore, I'm too busy. And I couldn't see the program die at Harriman. And so I said, I don't know anything about it, but I will take it on. And I'm so glad that I did, because that first year I had a student who was in the resource classes, and he came to try out, and he recited Caged Bird. And as he recited, I just got chills up and down. This little sophomore resource student, amazing though. And his performance wasn't quite as amazing on the stage once we got in front of everybody. But I developed a relationship with that student, and he competed every year. And his senior year, he actually won the region and competed at state. And he's the words that he was able to express that last year, I remember weeks and weeks he sat in my classroom trying to find, it was his third poem that he needed for state. He'd already memorized and had the other two, but he needed that third poem. And I would suggest some that I thought he would do well at, and he'd look at me like, I can see why you'd think I'd want to do that one, but no. So finally I was just like, here, JP, go ahead, take a look at it. You can figure it out. And we would sit for hours after school scouring the website by author, by theme, and those resources are amazing. And he finally came upon Harold's Chicken Shack, number 86, by Nate Marshall. And he own that poem, and that became his. And it was awesome to see him perform and just kind of take it. And he's like, how did I never know about this poem before? Nate Marshall's my favorite. And it was seeing that relationship and being able to see students internalize those poems and make them their own. Jean and Willie both mentioned my daughter, and it has been fun to watch Abby excel in the poetry world. And she is also a lifeguard, and she often will work the 5 a.m. shift. And there's not very many people there, so she just has to wander the pool, and she's like, that is my time between me and Poetry Out Loud. And the poems that go through my head from all 3 years that I've competed, they're just like on repeat. And she's like, and sometimes I just have to go and find another one to start, giving me something to do while I'm watching the pool, and internalizing them. And she says, there's certain poems that she'll fall in love with more, depending on the day that she's reading it or reciting it in her head. A lot of the question, but I'm also, Willie mentioned that I'm involved in Poetry Slam, and I did start a performance poetry class at Harriman High School. A lot of help to Steve from Copper Hills for helping me get that started. And that class was amazing for students. Some students that gravitate towards Poetry Slam, they don't have another place to be in the high schools, middle schools, wherever they're finding poetry, they're writing poetry, they're expressing their words and thoughts in poetry, and a lot of times they feel alone, and they do have their poetry, but it's so awesome to be able to see this group of students come together that need a place to be. And my classroom was able to be that safe place for those students where they could express their ideas, get feedback. And when you're competing in Poetry Slam, the feedback's not always nice. I mean, you get a score and you get cheers, sometimes you get boos, and it can be hard. And it's awesome though to be able to talk these students through it and help the students see that, it's not their thoughts and their feelings that are being judged, and ways to improve and to grow, and to be able to go from one spot to another. And I've been able to use Poetry Slam and Poetry Out Loud both in the classroom. And one way some of the questions did talk about bridging that gap. That's a really hard gap, because a lot of teachers feel like they can either do Poetry Slam, they can do Poetry Out Loud, but they don't do both. And I never really understood that. I love both. I love the idea that people can take Poetry Out Loud and make someone else's words their own. But I also love the idea that they can take their thoughts and feelings going on in their head and create amazing work on their own too. I think it's not, both isn't for everyone, but for those that are able to embrace both worlds, like Jean said, a lot of our winners are able to show that expression, and that's a lot of what Poetry Slam is as well. I had a student a few years ago who was in my creative writing class, and we had a slam and we were hosting, and one of our students on our slam team ended up being sick that day, couldn't come in, and we were down a team member. And to compete, we had to have 4 team members, and I knew all of my students at that point had a poem ready, because it was one of the assignments that we had just finished a couple of weeks before. And so I just kind of put out there who would be willing to, and this shy student, who she was a senior but very much introverted, very much kind of stayed in the corner, hoodie on, kept to herself, she raised her hand. And there were a few other people that did too, but if Kaylee was going to, I was going to let her. So I went and talked to her and I said, can you really do this? Do you really want to? And she's like, it terrifies me, but I really want to. So that night I said, okay, I'm going to let you, but we're going to have a runner up just in case. And so we did. But at the night of the Poetry Slam, she was supposed to go first. And she came up to me and she said, I can't breathe. And I said, okay, you just breathe. We're going to not put you first. I want you to just watch and see how it goes. We're going to just all I want you to concentrate is breathing. You can read your poem. Nothing else matters. You don't need to look at the crowd. You don't need to look at anything. So we did a first round and I turned over to her and thought, can you do this next round? She shook her head. I was like, okay. But she also knew she'd already told me there's no way I'm going last. Because that's kind of intimidating to be the last one too. And so second round goes and I look over to her and said, can you do the next round? And she takes a deep breath and says, I might die, but yes, I can. And you guys, she did it. And she got up there though, and she froze for a good minute before she said anything, luckily. So she wasn't on the clock, but she did freeze. And it was hard to watch her. You know, we empathize and I didn't know, do I go up? Do I pull her off? Do I take her out of this? But I kind of just let her stand there through it. And she took a deep breath and she started, and she wasn't a 10, but she did it. And to me, that's all and to her, that's all that mattered. And she became a regular after that. She's like, that was kind of addicting. It's terrifying in a really good way. Like, I want to do this every single month. Can I do it again? And it's, there is something about performing and being on that stage it's terrifying. But when the students are able to see people relating and give them the snaps and the claps, it makes them feel accepted. And a lot of times that's what our students need. In this crazy world right now, they want to be accepted. They want to be heard. They want to be acknowledged that someone else cares about what they're saying. And Poetry Slam and Poetry Out Loud through finding someone else's words is a great venue to be able to do that. So I've been really lucky to be a part of the Slam and the Poetry Out Loud programs and be able to watch students succeed and to have fun and to fall in love with words and poetry through these amazing programs.
Thank you so much, Sally. It's been such a joy to be able to hear everybody's perspectives and the like amazing interactions they've been able to have with different students and different writers. I'll speak a little bit about some of the resources that exist and encourage people. We're now entering like the free anarchy zone where we start having conversations. So please drop your questions into the chat, drop any comments, things you want to hear more about. The things that I will plug right now is that one, Jean and I and a lot of other people have been working really hard to try to bridge the programs between Poetry Out Loud and Poetry Slam. Part of that is by featuring our different students and highlighting them at different events. So like we were able to bring one of the very successful current Slam students over to perform over at the Poetry Out Loud state finals, for example. And we're going to have the winner from this year's Poetry Out Loud compete at the Utah State Poetry Slam finals. Compete was the wrong word. Be featured and do their performances, which is something that we're really excited about. They're going to be driving all the way up from St. George, but it's important. The other thing, since I just mentioned it, the Utah State Poetry Slam Finals will be April 29th. It's a Friday. It'll be on the Spy Hop rooftop, 6 p.m. Desiree Dalagiacomo will be giving a teacher's workshop on how to keep students motivated, especially through the midst of like pandemic and overwork. And then there's going to be a student workshop at 7 p.m. focusing on generating work, especially around joy. And then we're going to be going through our Poetry Slam, and Desiree is going to be performing some poems for us. If you haven't seen Desiree's work, it's all over the internet, especially places like Button Poetry, and she's just a phenomenal kind of speaker and voice. And one thing I will add on to that before we kind of go is I'm definitely sad Amanda couldn't be here just because of her commitment to like the Poetry Slam organization, especially throughout Utah. But part of the way that it works in Utah is that we have a loose association of teachers who hold monthly Poetry Slam events. Usually it's been like the last Friday of every month or so. And while people are gathering together to compete, I think the most valuable part of it is just like the ability to see students grow and interact with one another, especially when it comes to expressing themselves in their own words. I feel like every Poetry Out Loud / Poetry Slam educator probably has those stories of students who started off with like, very minimal public speaking skills, who suddenly like blossom into this charismatic like person who's very comfortable in their skin and just able to like, be a fish in water on stage after a while. I remember having, students I've coached from either the high school or undergrad level where you literally got to kind of hold them so that they stop trembling. And then later on, they're the ones giving the performance workshops and winning the awards and things like that. And that's always a transformation that like, poetry aside, like that's just a huge thing to be able to take with you as a human being out with you from these programs. Another huge part of it is also giving space to, students who don't have very many other spaces to go to be able to express themselves and have people who are willing to talk about difficult things. I think one of the most powerful and amazing things about poetry in general is that oftentimes it is most valuable when it's speaking towards things that we find unsayable or difficult to say, when it's breaking through those silences. So students do that. They bring their stories and, just because you're a teenager in high school doesn't mean like life doesn't happen to you. And they have a lot of things to express and even wisdom to share with everybody. And when it comes to creating those spaces, I think that's something that's almost equally important to keep in mind, as is like things like craft and like, oh, are you doing line breaks and all the stuff that happens on the page, where like sometimes it's like, no, part of the work here is just going through the content where it's being like, okay, you're trying to express this difficult thing. How do we say that in a way that's going to be healthy for you? How do we say that in a way that's going to reach your audience and get your point across? And those are huge conversations that like, even if like going beyond just like literary devices and stuff like that, those are like crucial skills for students to be developing. I guess to start off, since I don't see any questions in the Q&A yet, I think one of the biggest questions that teacher who is interested in doing this would be like, what's your advice to a newcomer? Like, yo, I want to start my poetry slam class or a poetry slam club, or, do poetry out loud for the first year. What would be your advice to people as they start getting involved in organizing, especially as, new teachers with overwhelming workloads who want to do the good work of poetry for their students? And we'll leave that to the panelists to just to mic themselves.
I'll jump in really quick to say that Willy in the Utah Humanities has been awesome. I was able to start a club at Harriman, and then we moved into the class, but it does get really busy life, especially the last few years of the pandemic and everything. And Willy in the Utah Humanities was able to provide some coaches, because I never competed in poetry slam. And while I know what I like and I hear and I listen to a lot of different things, those coaches that he have been able to provide the last couple of years have been amazing resources to help and to come in like once a week and work with students and to offer feedback and real life experience and to give that information. Also, it's really important that a lot of times, yes, we start a club, but sometimes too, I've had students that come and they want to be a part of it, and you got to find those students, because otherwise it's teacher driven, and it really needs to be student driven to be able to keep these clubs and these organizations alive, because otherwise you're killing yourself. And it is a lot of work. And so find those people in your schools, those students who are willing to help, and give them the responsibility. It's amazing what they'll step up and do and spread the word. And, one way at Harriman that we got people interested is we would get our poets, and we would, as part of the starter in different English classes, we'd say, can this student come in and give a slam at the beginning of the class? And so they would, and man, it just brought in the droves. They're like, that they wrote that was like 3 minutes long. That's kind of long. How did they do that? And they're like, just come to the club, find out. And it brought a lot of people in. And And they, even if they don't, if they're too nervous to get started on their own, it's a way that they can come and see the craft being done and started. And the whole process is kind of cool.
You know, Willie, in response to that question, all they need to do is call our office on Poetry Out Loud. We'll literally walk them through the process, and you know, I'm willing to come out to the school and have a chat with them. And you know, we go all over the state, so part of it is just knowing that our office is on the other end, and we are willing at any time to answer any questions or provide resources. And we also, Sally mentioned coaches. We also provide coaches free to any student at whatever level, whether it's at the local level or at the regional level, or then preparing for the state level. And I think it's also cool when I saw Matt, you recited, and one of your school-wide competitions, you got up there and recited. And I just thought that was so cool.
Yeah, I was actually going to jump in and say, from like a practical classroom teacher perspective for Poetry Out Loud, model it, right? Like if this is something you're passionate about, do it for your students. I share poems with my students all the time, you know, and we talk about like, why is this significant? What does this mean? I talk about my personal connections to it. And I really emphasize that poetry is both a written and a spoken art, right? Like it's the sound, but it's also the words on the page. And that has definitely connected some students who previously didn't care about poetry. And, you know, I recite a poem and they're like, that sounds like hip hop. I'm like, yeah, but it was written in the 1800s. And suddenly there's this, you know, renewed interest of, well, why is that? Like, how did they do that? How do I write something like that? How do I read a poem like that? That leads to more interest in the performance of poetry, not just the kind of dry academic analysis of it.
It's huge. And thank you, Sally and Jean, for reminding me. Utah Humanities does provide coaches all across the state. Okay, Utah Humanities does provide coaches all across the state. If you are in a rural place, we're happy to get somebody in there virtually, or if we have somebody nearby, we'll have them come in person. And a big idea of having these coaches is that, yeah, teachers are super overworked. So we encourage you to delegate a lot of the organizing task of like, hey, weekly, like, you know, generative workshop, creating that space to the student over to these coaches. And we vet them and put them through a little training program. And a lot of them are folks who have competed in the high school circuit and have now, you know, gone to undergrad or whatever, and still participated in slam, or have had years of experience competing in national competitions and stuff like that too. So they get to bring all of that sort of expertise and experience into the classroom and be like, hey, it is what I did in like X, Y, and Z state. Here's the cool places that poetry has like opened for me. And I think that those stories can also be crazy when you hear like, yeah, you know, like this person just from like thoughts that they were writing in their notebook got to like see other parts of the country through the craft. And those are those sort of experiences that are just priceless. We can take one more question before Paisley comes on and declares this an end. So I want to give the audience, I'm doing a few nudges. I'll even say some names. I see Gray in the house. I see Kathy in the house. I see Monson. Do we have any questions coming in, or are we inviting Paisley to take the stage?
While everybody's waiting, I was going to just mention one thing too. It's always good to, as you're trying to build a program, to get, well, admin support is always great, right? And luckily at Harriman, we had amazing support from our administration. So much so that actually this last year at their beginning of the year meetings, he actually wrote a slam poem himself and performed it for the staff. And it was kind of cool to see. He such a big supporter. He really believes, and once you show administration what poetry, slam and Poetry Out Loud's about, they see that, yeah, these kids that are really struggling, they have a place and an outlet and a safe place for them to be able to share their thoughts and stuff. And so that's always an amazing part too.
I'm jumping on here. I thought I saw Michael's hand raised very briefly in there, but I don't know if Michael's still interested in asking a question, but if not, I would also like to say, if anyone wants to reach out with more questions, I'm sure any and all of our panelists would be delighted to take those questions, and you can send them to me at paisleyrekdal.com, and I can send them on to the panel as well. I just want to say this was fantastic. This is so great to get all these practical and useful tips and resources. I would also like to say that you should all use Jean and Willy as much as you can. They are just absolute gems in the state for all of this kind of work. And I have seen firsthand some of these kids performing in Poetry Out Loud, and certainly the Poetry Slam teams that have been coming through, and they are phenomenal. So thank you all for this wonderful panel. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Willy. Thank you, Jean. Thank you all out there. Again, the next panel will be starting pretty shortly, and it's on artists' books. And after that, we'll be talking about line and stanza. So please register. The registration's in the link, or you can go to utahpoetryfestival.com. Thanks again, everybody, and have a wonderful Saturday.